Writing a good story was a crucial part of transitioning from this to this. Welcome to the first part of a video series in which I will delve deep into how we created our Game Boy game, Pine Creek. Spoiler warning: if you're watching this video without having played the game first, I recommend playing it before continuing. It's free on itch.io and it won't take you more than 3 hours to complete. Let's continue. When GB Studio was released in 2019, I immediately knew it could fulfill my dream of creating a game for the console that defined my childhood as a 90s kid. I was one of the millions of kids obsessed with Pokemon, and this obsession is quite evident in Pine Creek's visual style. However, it wasn't just because I wanted to copy. As we'll see in another video, and as those who've played it know, there's a reason behind this. I already had some experience experimenting with Unreal Engine and Unity, so I knew that the best way to finish a project is to make it as small as possible, which is why Pine Creek is deliberately a short game. When studying GB Studio, it became quite clear that the engine worked best for top-down adventures without combat or action. As a gamer, the first thing that comes to mind when you want to make a game is epic adventures full of graphics, action, and frenzied combat. Trying something like that will be a big mistake. Great games can be created without the need for action and combat. Many of my favorites are walking sims, visual novels, RPGs, with large amounts of text. Besides being a gamer, I'm a fiction reader, and I studied literature, so I decided to do what I'm best at, a story-based game. Now, what kind of story? A grand fantasy or science fiction adventure will be too much for me to accomplish on my own in a short time. Horror stories are popular in movies and games because they can be made relatively cheaply, but horror isn't really my thing. So I opted for one of my favorite and most popular genres, one that appeals to the majority of the audiences, the detective genre or noir novel. A big advantage of this genre and its subgenres is that they can quickly draw in the audience if the crime or mystery to be solved is intriguing enough. Pine Creek doesn't strictly adhere to these genres, but it takes many cues from the detective genre. I will quote one of my favorite authors, Jorge Barguengoitia, and his little treatise on the detective genre to exemplify my decision. Postulate: the detective genre is not a literary genre, it's a game. Definition: in every detective work, there is a killer, or not. As we will see later, the game consists of discovering their identity. Warning: do not confuse the detective genre with others related to it, like A. the suspense, B. the private detective. Rules for playing the detective genre. Rule 1. Since there will be between 1 and 10 dead bodies, it is convenient for the characters to be flat and straw-like, without many human traits, because otherwise, the work runs the risk of becoming a sea of blood. Rule 2. The plot can be as complicated as you want, but when, in the end, it turns out that the killer is a bishop, the audience must think before 15 seconds. Of course, it couldn't have been any other way. A work in which the detective has to explain: when the bishop left Lord Patterson's house at 8:10 p.m., he got into a taxi and inside he disguised himself as Lady Paperton's black maid, left the taxi at Charing Cross, etc., etc. Elapsed time 15 minutes. When the detective has to explain this, I say the work is not good. Rule 3. Never make moral reflections. In the detective genre, anything goes. Children kill their parents, parents kill their children, husbands kill their wives, etc. The moment someone says, "I killed my poor father to relieve him of his suffering," the work becomes a real slaughterhouse. Rule 4. Do not overuse the following equation. Motive plus opportunity equals suspected killer. In every work, there must be several suspected killers. If in a work, a murder occurs, and only one person could have committed it, there's no mystery. That's the killer. Or the work is poorly written. It's important to remember that not all people are capable of committing murder, even if they have the opportunity. The rule can be summarized as follows. The characters must be straw-like according to Rule 1, but not so much. In the same way that I took many rules from this detective game, I took liberties to blend in other genres and draw inspiration from other innovative works, such as Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, from which I took the protagonist's name Atso of Milk, and other works with elements of historical, religious, esoteric investigation, like Gabriel Knight. One curious thing that happened was that I wanted an ending where the victim weaves a series of clues from the protagonist to find her abuser while she pretended to be dead. It wasn't until I completed the script that I realized I was unconsciously drawing a lot of inspiration from the first part of the Millennium Trilogy, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. The major downside of the detective genre is that once the mystery is solved, there's usually no reason to revisit the story, which means there's no replayability unless you have multiple endings. My problem with multiple endings, besides extending development time exponentially, is a quality versus quantity problem. Let me explain. For Pine Creek to stand out, I wanted the story to have a great build-up and a great resolution. This wasn't easy, because I didn't want simple endings where someone just lives or dies based on whether you perform a specific action as a player. Personally, this kind of structure causes me a lot of anxiety. I hate getting bad endings because I forgot to click on a tiny item and I have to replay the entire game. Structure in writing is quite important, almost fundamental. I don't mean to say that you can't create a game with excellent multiple endings. I mean, it's very challenging for a single person. So, to help me structure Pine Creek's story before writing the script, I relied on a couple of books I had already read to write the story for my dream game, which I hope to create someday. In particular, I used the 5-act story structure from John Yorke's book Into the Woods, a 5-act journey into story. There are other books like The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, famous for being the one George Lucas based Star Wars on, and another very useful book was Creating Character Arcs by K.M. Wieland. It took me half an hour to sketch out and structure the script one afternoon. The idea was to create a game that I could develop in a couple of months, even though it ended up being a year plus another year for the colorized multilingual version. I took the 5-act structure and divided the story into 5 days, roughly corresponding to each act. Following John Yorke, let's break down each day of the game as an act in its structure. Act 1. The inciting incident. It's the event that disrupts the protagonist's life balance and presents them with a problem or challenge to solve. It's the starting point of the story and the trigger for the action. Day 1. In this day, we get to know Atso and his surroundings before moving on to the inciting incident, which is the crime scene at Judith's house. Act 2. The journey. It's the path the protagonist travels to confront the problem or challenge and undergoes a change or learns something. It's the longest part of the story, where most obstacles, conflicts and twists occur. Day 2 in the game. On the second day, also the longest day of the game, Atso begins to investigate and embarks on a both physical and intellectual journey to Apricot City, gradually solving the mystery and the first puzzle. Act 3. The crisis. It's the most critical and dramatic moment of the story, where the protagonist must make a difficult decision that will determine the final outcome. It's the point of no return and the emotional climax of the story. Day 3 in the game. On this day, there are mostly more puzzles and a setup for the next day. Act 4. The climax. Is the consequence of the protagonist's decision and the resolution of the problem or challenge. It's the highest point of action and the physical climax of the story. Day 4 in the game. The crisis and climax are really intertwined on day 4, which is when Atso solves the puzzles that would lead him to the basement of the Love Hotel to uncover the harsh reality and confront the real villains. 5. The release. It's the story's resolution, where the protagonist's new life balance is shown after the change or learning. It's the story's closure and the moment of reflection or catharsis. Day 5 in the game. This is the day when we discover the truth about Judith's whereabouts and the closing of the characters' stories. I live in a country where violence against women and child trafficking is sadly so common, it erupted into a series of protests by feminist groups and the general population in recent years. There are countless cases of women being murdered, where the crimes go unpunished, where law enforcement is involved, and where the hand of drug cartels is always present. I was pouring everything current in the society that surrounds me. Also, in some way, I included cases of cults like the Church of the Light of the World, whose leader Nason Joaquin Garcia was arrested in Los Angeles on 26 charges of child sexual abuse, rape, possession of child pornography, and human trafficking. And I don't need to delve into the countless cases of child abuse by the Catholic Church, but that was only meant to be the backdrop of the story. I didn't want to turn my game into a documentary or magazine article that will bore players. There are many literary and audiovisual works that inspire me, some more obvious and some more obscure. Lastly, much of Pine Creek includes memories and experiences from my own life, mixed with fiction, as it's almost impossible for an author not to leave a bit of themselves in their work. Also, opening up and portraying your interpretation of the world gives your work a soul, isn't it? There were 2 scenes added based on fan suggestions and the publisher's input, the prologue and the flashback. The flashback was added because my original script lacked a way to introduce Judith as a character, something I fully agreed with, and so I wrote the scene in the hot springs. The prologue was a suggestion from the publisher to further develop the protagonist, and I was a bit hesitant because I was afraid players would get bored reading it. Therefore, I decided to make it as interactive as possible with the time I had. I wanted the player to take control as quickly as possible to avoid friction and boredom. In the end, I'm happy with the prologue, and it no longer seems to me to be detrimental to the game. I'll conclude this video with the rules for the viewer from Jorge Barguengoitia's small treatise on the detective genre. Rules for the viewer. If at the end of the work it turns out that everything was a dream, get up and break the seats. If it turns out that the maid didn't look closely and thought the pillows were corpses and the ink was blood, get up and burn the theater. If the detective receives a letter from someone whose name was mentioned in the first scene and takes it out at the end of the play to reveal the mystery, burn the theater. Thank you for watching the first part of a series of videos in which I will explain in depth how we created our Game Boy game Pine Creek. This is a series for Carmelo Electronics patrons. You can follow this series by becoming a patron and supporting me in continuing to create games and related content. In the next videos, we will discuss puzzles, localization, art style, colorization, music, sound effects, and publishing a Game Boy game. Until next time.